My mother-in-law sold my house while I was recovering from childbirth. She ended up dirt poor. My husband Ryan and I bought our house 3 years ago using my inheritance from my grandfather. The deed was in my name only because Ryan had terrible credit from student loans. It was a small 3-bedroom place but perfect for starting a family, which we'd been planning since we got married. Ryan's mother Diane had been a nightmare since day one, constantly saying Ryan married down because I was a nurse, and she'd wanted him to marry his ex, who was a lawyer. She especially hated that I owned the house and Ryan didn't. She kept telling everyone Ryan was living in his wife's house like some kept man. When I got pregnant, Diane suddenly became interested in our living situation. She started dropping hints about how we needed a bigger place for the baby, how the neighborhood wasn't good enough, how her friend was a realtor who could get us a great deal. I told her we were perfectly happy where we were. The nursery was already painted, the house was paid off, and we didn't need a mortgage with a baby coming. That made her furious because it reminded her that I'd bought the house outright and Ryan couldn't have done that. 2 months before my due date, Diane started showing up when Ryan was at work, bringing random people she said were friends who wanted to see the house. I thought it was weird, but pregnancy brain made me too tired to argue. She'd walk them through every room, pointing out things she'd change, talking about the house like she knew everything about it. Then she asked to borrow my house keys because she wanted to drop off baby supplies while we were at work. Ryan thought it was sweet that his mom wanted to help. I gave her the spare key. Big mistake. 3 weeks before my due date, Diane convinced Ryan that I needed to add him to the deed before the baby came, saying it would protect our child if something happened to me during delivery. She actually printed out deed transfer papers and brought them to us. Ryan was confused because he thought his name was already on it. I explained again about his credit situation from when we bought it. Diane acted shocked, said that was so long ago and surely it didn't matter now. She kept pushing until I said we'd discuss it after the baby was born. Labor started fast. My water broke at 2 in the morning and Ryan rushed me to the hospital. I was in labor for 37 hours. During that time, Diane had Ryan's phone because he was focused on me. She kept leaving the room to supposedly update family members. What she was actually doing was texting from Ryan's phone and handling something completely different. Our daughter was born healthy, but I hemorrhaged and needed emergency surgery. While I was unconscious, Diane told Ryan he needed to go home and get my insurance cards from my desk because the hospital needed them. That was a lie. The hospital already had everything. While Ryan was gone, Diane stayed in my room. She went through my purse, found my driver's license and social security card, and took pictures of everything. She also had Ryan's information from his phone. 2 days later, while I was still recovering and learning to breastfeed, a woman showed up in my hospital room with papers. She said she was from the title company and needed me to sign some corrections on the deed transfer to add Ryan's name. I was on pain medication, exhausted, had just fed the baby, and Diane was standing right there saying this was what we'd discussed. She said the lawyer made a mistake and put the transfer date as that day instead of 3 years ago when we bought it. I was so out of it, I signed where she pointed. Except it wasn't adding Ryan to my deed. It was transferring the house to Ryan only. And Diane had already arranged for Ryan to sign papers the day before when he went home, telling him it was power of attorney paperwork for my medical decisions. 5 days after giving birth, we came home to find our locks changed and a sold sign in the yard. Diane was standing in the driveway with a man she introduced as the new owner. She said Ryan had sold the house because we needed something bigger for the baby. She'd set up the whole thing, used the photos of my documents to forge initial agreements, had Ryan unknowingly sign the sale papers, and sold my house for cash to her friend's son for half its value. The buyer, Kevin, was standing there smirking, already having contractors there to start renovations. Ryan was completely confused, said he never agreed to sell anything. Diane said he signed the papers and she helped facilitate everything as his mother. She actually said I should thank her for handling everything while I was being dramatic at the hospital. I called the police, but they said it was a civil matter since papers were signed. Kevin said all the paperwork was legal, and we had 72 hours to get our stuff out. Diane had already rented us an apartment across town, a 1-bedroom place she said would teach us to be grateful. She kept saying young people didn't need to own houses anyway. Here's where Diane messed up. Kevin wasn't just her friend's son. He was a contractor who'd lost his license 2 years ago for fraud. I'm standing in my driveway holding my 5-day-old daughter, while this smirking stranger tells me I have 3 days to get out of my own house. Ryan is frantically calling the police again, and I can hear Diane in the background saying we should be grateful she found us an apartment, like she did us some kind of favor by stealing my home. My daughter starts crying and I'm trying to calm her down while Kevin keeps explaining how all the paperwork is legal and binding. He's acting like this is just business, like he didn't know exactly what he was doing when he bought my house for half its value from a woman who had no right to sell it. The contractors are already measuring the living room windows, and I can see them looking at me like I'm the problem, like I'm some crazy lady who won't leave. Ryan finally gets through to the police dispatcher and they say someone will come out within the hour. Diane walks over and tries to touch the baby, and I actually step back from her. She looks hurt, but I don't care anymore. She just stole my house and she's acting like I'm being mean to her. Kevin hands Ryan a printed timeline of when we need to have our stuff out and what will happen if we don't comply. My legs feel weak and I sit down on the front steps because I'm only 5 days post-surgery and I shouldn't even be standing this long. The baby is still crying and I need to feed her, but I'm not going to do that out here in front of these people. Ryan sits down next to me and puts his arm around my shoulders and I can feel him shaking. He keeps saying he's sorry, that he had no idea what his mom was doing, that he thought he was signing medical papers. I believe him because Ryan is terrible at reading legal documents and Diane knows that. She spent his whole life handling things for him and telling him what to sign. One of the contractors comes over and asks if we need help moving boxes to a truck, and Ryan tells him to get away from us. The guy backs off, but I can tell they're all just waiting for us to leave, so they can start tearing apart my house. The police arrive and spend 30 minutes reviewing all the paperwork Kevin brought, and the officer finally tells us it looks legally binding, even though we never intended to sell. He's looking at the signatures and the dates and the title transfer documents, and he keeps shaking his head like he's seen this kind of thing before, but there's nothing he can do about it. Kevin is standing there with his arms crossed, looking confident, while Diane hovers nearby, trying to explain how she was just helping us make a smart financial decision. The officer asks me if I signed the papers, and I explain about being in the hospital on pain medication 5 days after giving birth and emergency surgery. He asks Ryan if he signed anything, and Ryan shows him the papers Diane gave him that he thought were medical power of attorney. The officer says this is clearly a civil matter, and we need to get a lawyer immediately, because it's beyond a simple property dispute. He suggests we document everything and file a complaint with the district attorney's office about possible fraud. My hands are shaking, so hard I can barely hold my phone to start searching for lawyers. The officer gives us a card for legal aid services and says we should call them first thing Monday morning. It's Saturday afternoon and I realize we have the whole weekend to sit with this nightmare before we can even start trying to fix it. Kevin asks the officer if he can proceed with the renovations, and the officer says as far as he can tell the sale is legal, so yes. I start crying again and the baby is crying and Ryan is trying to talk to the officer about fraud and forgery, but the officer just keeps saying we need a lawyer. Diane actually tries to hug me and I push her away hard enough that she stumbles. Ryan yells at his mother to leave and she looks shocked, like she really doesn't understand why we're upset with her. The officer asks if there's going to be a problem and Ryan says no, we're leaving, we just need time to get our stuff. Kevin says we have 72 hours and not a minute more. The police officer leaves and we're standing there with Diane and Kevin and the contractors, and I feel like I'm in some horrible dream where nothing makes sense. Ryan's sister calls after hearing what happened and she's absolutely furious with Diane, saying their mother has always been controlling but this crosses every line. Her name is Jennifer and she's calling because one of Diane's neighbors saw the police at our house and told her something was wrong. Ryan puts her on speaker and Jennifer is yelling about how Diane has always been manipulative, but this is actual fraud and she could go to jail. She asks if we have a lawyer and Ryan says no, we just found out an hour ago. Jennifer says her friend had a property dispute last year and used this attorney named Maddie Orr, who was amazing at real estate fraud cases. She's texting me Maddie's number while we're still on the phone and telling me to call immediately, not to wait until Monday. I'm calling Maddie's office before we even finish the conversation with Jennifer. The phone rings 4 times and I think it's going to go to voicemail, but then someone picks up. A woman says this is Maddie Orr's office and I just start talking, explaining everything in this rushed, panicked voice about the hospital and the signatures, and coming home to find our house sold. She stops me and says Maddie is actually in the office finishing up some weekend work and can see us in an hour if we can get there. I say yes immediately, and she gives me the address. Ryan is already putting the baby in her car seat and we're leaving our house with Kevin and his contractors already inside, measuring and planning their renovations. Maddie meets with us that same afternoon at her office, and I'm still wearing my loose maternity clothes with spit up on my shoulder while trying to breastfeed discreetly during the consultation. Her office is small but organized with files stacked neatly on every surface and law books lining the walls. Maddie is maybe 40 with short dark hair and glasses, and she has this very focused energy that makes me feel like she's actually listening. She reviews every document with this intense focus and keeps circling back to the timeline, asking detailed questions about who had access to what information and when. She wants to know exactly when Diane asked for the house keys, when she started bringing people through, when the hospital papers were signed, everything. Ryan and I take turns explaining, and Maddie is taking notes in this very precise handwriting. She asks to see the papers I signed in the hospital, and I show her the photos I took on my phone before we left the house. Maddie zooms in on the signature and the date and the witness line. She asks who witnessed my signature, and I say the woman from the title company and Diane. Maddie's eyes get sharper, and she asks if I was on pain medication, and I say yes, heavy pain medication. Plus, I was exhausted from 37 hours of labor. She asks Ryan about the papers he signed, and he shows her photos of those too. Maddie spreads out all the documents on her desk and starts comparing signatures and dates, and I can see her getting more interested as the fraud pattern becomes obvious. She asks about Kevin, and I tell her he's an unlicensed contractor who lost his license for fraud 2 years ago. Maddie actually smiles for the first time and says that's very helpful information. She asks how we found that out, and Ryan says his sister Jennifer knows someone who worked with Kevin before. Maddie says she wants to run a full background check on Kevin and on the title company representative who came to the hospital. Maddie explains that the forged signatures and my medicated state create grounds for voiding the sale, but we need to act fast because Kevin is already starting renovations, and every day makes it harder to undo. She's talking about filing an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order to stop any changes to the property while we fight the sale in court. She says the fact that I was in the hospital recovering from surgery and on medication makes the signature questionable at best. The fact that Ryan thought he was signing medical papers and not sale documents is also important. She asks if we have any proof that Diane had access to our personal documents, and I tell her about giving her the spare key and how she was alone in my hospital room. Maddie says that's circumstantial but useful. She asks about our finances and whether we can afford to fight this, and Ryan and I look at each other. I tell her we have some savings but not a lot, and I'm supposed to be on maternity leave for 6 more weeks. Maddie says she'll work with us on payment plans, and that the most important thing right now is stopping Kevin from doing any more work on the house. She files an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order right there while we're sitting in her office. She's typing fast and pulling up legal precedents and explaining what she's doing as she goes. For the first time since this nightmare started, I feel like someone is actually fighting for us instead of just telling us we're screwed. Maddie says the hearing will probably be in 3 or 4 days, and we need to document everything Kevin does to the house between now and then. She tells us to drive by and take photos every few hours if possible. She also says we need to gather every piece of paper Diane ever gave us about the house. Every text message, every email, everything. Ryan says most of that is on his phone, and Maddie says to forward it all to her immediately. While waiting for the court hearing, Maddie's investigator digs into Kevin's background and discovers he lost his contractor license after defrauding 3 clients out of over $200,000 total. The investigator's name is Mike, and he calls Maddie 3 days after our first meeting with information. Maddie calls us and puts Mike on speaker. Mike explains that Kevin had a contracting business 5 years ago, and he took deposits from 3 different families for major renovations. He did some initial work, then disappeared with their money. The families sued and won, but Kevin declared bankruptcy, so they never got paid. The state revoked his contractor license, and he's not supposed to be doing any contracting work. Mike says this is important because it shows a pattern of fraud and targeting vulnerable people. The investigator finds Dominic Palmer, Kevin's former business partner who got burned in the previous scam. Dominic is more than willing to share documentation about Kevin's fraudulent practices and pattern of targeting vulnerable people. Mike says Dominic actually called him back within an hour of being contacted and has boxes of documents from their business together. Dominic wants Kevin to face real consequences this time. Maddie says Dominic's testimony could be huge for our case because it establishes that Kevin knows exactly what he's doing when he takes advantage of people. She asks if we're okay with her reaching out to Dominic directly, and we say yes, absolutely. Mike gives us Dominic's contact information too in case we want to talk to him ourselves. Ryan calls Dominic that night and they talk for almost an hour. Dominic tells Ryan that Kevin specifically looks for people in crisis situations because they're too overwhelmed to read paperwork carefully. He did it to the 3 families he defrauded, and he's doing it to us now. Dominic says he lost his life savings in Kevin's previous scam and has been waiting for a chance to see him face real consequences. Diane shows up at our cramped apartment unannounced, bringing baby supplies like nothing is wrong. It's been 4 days since we moved into this tiny 1-bedroom place, and we're still living out of boxes. The doorbell rings, and I look through the peephole and see Diane standing there with shopping bags. I don't want to let her in, but Ryan is in the shower and the baby starts crying, and I'm too tired to deal with this. I open the door and Diane walks in like she owns the place. She starts unpacking the bags and pulling out diapers and baby clothes and formula even though I'm breastfeeding. She's talking about how cute the apartment is and how cozy, and aren't we lucky she found it for us. When Ryan confronts her about the house, she acts confused and hurt that we're being ungrateful. He comes out of the bathroom in sweatpants with his hair still wet and sees his mother and just stops. Diane smiles at him and says she brought supplies for the baby. Ryan asks her what she's doing here, and Diane says she wanted to check on her granddaughter. Ryan says she needs to leave, and Diane looks shocked. She actually says we're overreacting and that young couples don't need to own homes anyway, that renting builds character. She says we'll thank her someday when we realize she saved us from being house poor. Ryan finally loses his temper and tells his mother to leave and not come back until she's ready to admit what she did. Diane starts crying and saying she was just trying to help, that she thought we'd be happier with a fresh start. Ryan raises his voice and says she stole our house and she needs to leave now. Diane grabs her purse and walks to the door and turns around and says we're making a huge mistake getting lawyers involved. She says Kevin is a nice young man and we should just accept the situation. Then she leaves and Ryan punches the wall hard enough to put a dent in it. I'm holding the baby and trying not to cry, and Ryan is shaking with anger. He calls Jennifer and tells her what just happened, and Jennifer says she's coming over. She arrives 20 minutes later with takeout food and stays with us for hours talking about how their mother has always been like this. The temporary restraining order hearing happens 3 days after we were supposed to be out, and the judge grants it after reviewing the evidence of my medical state and the suspicious timing. We're in a courtroom that's smaller than I expected, with just us and Maddie and Kevin and his lawyer and the judge. The judge is a woman in her 50s who looks tired but sharp. Maddie presents all the documents and explains the timeline and shows photos of me in the hospital. She has my medical records showing the hemorrhage and the emergency surgery and the pain medications I was on. Kevin's lawyer argues that the sale was legal and binding and that we're just having buyer's remorse. The judge asks Kevin directly if he knew I was in the hospital when the papers were signed, and Kevin says yes, but that doesn't invalidate the sale. The judge asks if he knew I was on pain medication, and Kevin hesitates and says he wasn't aware of my medical condition. Maddie pulls out text messages between Kevin and Diane where Diane specifically mentions that I just had surgery and am recovering. The judge looks at Kevin very coldly and says the timing is suspicious at best. She grants the temporary restraining order and says Kevin has to stop all renovation work immediately. But we still can't move back in yet because the sale hasn't been voided, just frozen. The judge says there will be a full hearing in 2 weeks to determine if the sale should be reversed. I'm crying in the courthouse bathroom because this partial victory still means we're stuck in this tiny apartment with a newborn. Kevin has to stop all work, but he still owns the house on paper. Maddie finds me in the bathroom and says this is actually a really good result. She says the judge clearly saw through Kevin's lies and the full hearing will probably go our way. But 2 more weeks feels impossible right now. Our savings are draining fast between attorney fees and the higher rent on the apartment Diane picked, and I'm supposed to be on maternity leave, but I'm getting calls from my nurse supervisor about when I'm coming back. The apartment costs $300 more per month than our mortgage did, and we're paying that plus our regular bills plus Maddie's fees. Ryan sits down with our bank statements and credit cards one night after the baby finally falls asleep. He spreads everything out on the tiny kitchen table and starts adding up numbers. We realize we can maybe afford 2 more months of legal fees before we have to make impossible choices between fighting for our house and paying for basic needs. I'm getting calls from my supervisor asking about my return date, and I keep saying I don't know. I'm supposed to have 6 more weeks of leave, but we need the money. Ryan's job as an IT technician doesn't pay enough to cover everything. We talk about me going back to work early, but the baby is only 2 weeks old and I'm still recovering from surgery. My supervisor is understanding, but I can tell the hospital needs nurses and they're getting impatient. Ryan suggests we ask his sister for a loan, but I don't want to do that. Jennifer has already helped us so much. We look at credit card offers and personal loans and everything has terrible interest rates. I start crying because we're in this situation because of Diane and Kevin, and now we might have to go into debt to fight them. Ryan says we'll figure it out, but I can see he's scared too. We decide to wait until after the next hearing to make any big financial decisions. If we lose the house, then we'll need money for a security deposit and moving costs. If we win, then we just need to survive until we can move back in. Dominic Palmer contacts Maddie directly and offers to testify about Kevin's fraud patterns, and he brings documentation showing Kevin specifically targets people in crisis situations when they're too overwhelmed to read paperwork carefully. Maddie calls us the next morning excited about Dominic's evidence. She says Dominic has contracts and emails and text messages from the previous fraud cases that show Kevin's exact method. He finds people who are dealing with family emergencies or medical crises or financial problems, and he offers to help them. Then he gets them to sign documents they don't fully understand while they're distracted and stressed. Dominic lost his life savings in Kevin's previous scam and has been waiting for a chance to see him face real consequences. Maddie says Dominic is willing to testify at the full hearing, and his testimony could be the key to proving this wasn't just a messy sale, but deliberate fraud. She asks if we want to meet with Dominic before the hearing, and we say yes. We meet him at a coffee shop near our apartment, and Dominic is this thin, nervous guy in his 40s who looks like he hasn't slept well in years. He shows us folders full of documents and explains how Kevin convinced him to invest their business savings in a property flip that never happened. Kevin took the money and disappeared, and Dominic couldn't pay his employees or his rent. He lost everything. Dominic says when Mike called him about our case, he knew immediately it was the same pattern. He says Kevin always targets people who are vulnerable and overwhelmed. He asks about our baby, and I tell him she's 3 weeks old now. Dominic says Kevin probably planned the whole thing around my due date, knowing we'd be too distracted to fight back. That makes me feel sick because it means this was all calculated from the beginning. I leave the coffee shop with all of Dominic's documents in a folder and my baby sleeping in her carrier against my chest. Ryan drives us home and we're both quiet because knowing Kevin planned this around my due date makes everything feel worse. Back at the apartment, I feed the baby and try not to think about how Diane watched me labor for 37 hours, knowing what she was setting up. My phone rings and it's Ryan's sister Jennifer asking if we're coming to Thanksgiving at her house next week. I tell her we can't if Diane will be there, and Jennifer says she understands completely. She says Ryan's brother Mark feels the same way and won't attend if Diane is invited, but their other brother Todd thinks we're making too big a deal out of this. Jennifer says Todd actually told her that mothers sometimes overstep, but that's just how Diane is, and we should forgive her. I'm so angry I have to put the phone down for a minute. Jennifer says she's hosting Thanksgiving just for us and Mark's family, and Diane isn't welcome until she admits what she did wrong. Ryan gets on the phone and thanks his sister, and I can hear him crying a little. He tells Jennifer he never thought he'd have to choose between his mom and his wife, but Diane made that choice for him when she stole our house. After he hangs up, he sits on our cramped apartment couch and stares at the wall. He says his whole childhood Diane controlled everything, and he always just went along with it because fighting her was exhausting. He says he should have protected me better and set boundaries years ago. I sit next to him, and we don't talk for a while. The baby wakes up crying, and I change her diaper on the floor because there's barely room in this apartment for a changing table. 3 days later, Maddie calls with news about a settlement offer. Kevin's attorney contacted her with what they're calling a generous compromise. We'd get back 70% of the house's actual value in cash, and Kevin keeps the property. Maddie says we need to meet in person to discuss this, so we drive to her office with the baby. She spreads out papers on her desk showing the numbers. The house was worth about $320,000, and Kevin bought it for $160,000. His offer would give us $224,000. Maddie explains that going to trial is expensive and the outcome isn't guaranteed even with all our evidence. She says trials can take a year or more and cost tens of thousands in legal fees. But if we accept this offer, it means Diane and Kevin get away with stealing almost $100,000 of my inheritance. I'm shaking, I'm so mad. I tell Maddie I want to fight this all the way because they can't just steal from us and then offer to give back most of it like they're doing us a favor. Ryan agrees, but he looks worried about the cost. Maddie says she understands and she thinks we have a strong case, but she has to be honest about the risks and expenses. We tell her we're not accepting the offer, and she nods and says she'll let Kevin's attorney know. On the drive home, Ryan and I talk about money again. We have maybe $6,000 left in savings after paying Maddie's retainer and the first month's rent on this apartment. If the trial takes a year, we'll be completely broke even if we win. Ryan suggests asking his sister for a loan, but I say no, because Jennifer has already done so much. We look at our credit cards when we get home, and all of them have high interest rates. I start crying because we're in this mess because of Diane and Kevin, and now we might go into debt fighting them. Ryan says we'll figure something out, but I can see he's scared too. The next week, Maddie's investigator calls her with information about Diane's finances. Maddie meets us at a coffee shop and tells us what he found. Diane is in serious debt, over $40,000 on credit cards, and she's facing foreclosure on her condo. The investigator found emails between Diane and Kevin from 6 months ago, where they discussed the house sale plan. Kevin promised Diane $20,000 for helping him get the property at half price. Maddie shows us printouts of the emails, and I read them on my phone while trying to keep the baby from grabbing the papers. Diane wrote things like, "This will solve both our problems, and Ryan will understand eventually." Kevin's responses talk about timing it right and making sure all the paperwork looks legitimate. Reading my mother-in-law's words about stealing my house makes me feel sick. Maddie says this proves Diane wasn't just being controlling or making a mistake. She actively planned to commit fraud for money. Ryan reads the emails and his hands are shaking. He says he knew his mom was difficult, but he never thought she'd do something criminal to her own son. Maddie explains that this evidence strengthens our case significantly because it shows planning and intent. She's going to submit everything to the district attorney's office to see if they'll pursue criminal charges. I ask what that means, and Maddie says both Kevin and Diane could face fraud charges if the DA thinks there's enough evidence. She warns us that criminal cases move slowly, and there's no guarantee they'll prosecute, but having a criminal investigation happening might pressure Kevin to settle on better terms. 2 weeks later, a detective calls our apartment and says his name is Casper Freeman from the district attorney's fraud division. He wants to interview me about what happened and asks if he can come to our place. I agree, and he shows up the next afternoon in plain clothes with a notebook. The baby is fussy, and I'm trying to feed her while answering his questions. Detective Freeman asks me to walk through everything from the beginning. I tell him about Diane's behavior during my pregnancy, giving her the spare key, going into labor, the hemorrhage, and emergency surgery. He writes everything down and asks specific questions about my medical state when I signed the papers. I explain about the pain medication and exhaustion, and how I'd just finished breastfeeding when the title company woman showed up. He asks if Diane was in the room, and I say yes. She was standing right there telling me this was what we'd discussed. Detective Freeman looks disturbed when I describe signing the papers while barely conscious. He asks about Ryan's part in it, and I explain how Diane tricked him into signing papers he thought were medical power of attorney. The baby starts crying hard, and I have to stop the interview to walk around and calm her down. Detective Freeman waits patiently and says he has kids, so he understands. When I sit back down, he asks about the emails Maddie's investigator found. I tell him Maddie has copies of everything, and he says he'll get those from her. He asks if I think Diane planned this specifically around my due date, and I say yes, that's exactly what happened. She waited until I was most vulnerable to execute her plan. Detective Freeman closes his notebook and says this is one of the worst cases of exploitation he's seen. He says taking advantage of someone right after childbirth and emergency surgery is particularly disturbing. He tells me the DA's office will review everything and decide about criminal charges within a few weeks. After he leaves, I sit on the couch feeling drained. Ryan comes home from work and I tell him about the interview. He asks if I'm okay and I say no. I'm really not okay. The stress of everything catches up with me 2 weeks after the detective's visit. I wake up with a splitting headache and my vision is blurry. Ryan is getting ready for work and I try to stand up but the room spins. He asks what's wrong and I say I don't feel right. My head is pounding and I feel dizzy. Ryan takes my blood pressure with the monitor we got after I left the hospital and it's dangerously high. He calls his sister to come watch the baby and drives me to the emergency room. The ER doctor examines me and orders blood tests. She comes back an hour later and says I'm showing signs of postpartum preeclampsia, and my blood pressure is high enough that I could have a stroke. She says if we'd waited any longer, it could have been really bad. They admit me overnight for monitoring and give me medication to bring my blood pressure down. Ryan is terrified and keeps asking the doctor if I'm going to be okay. She says I should recover fine with proper treatment and rest, but I need to reduce my stress levels significantly. I'm lying in a hospital bed with an IV in my arm, realizing this legal fight is literally threatening my life. The nurse checks my blood pressure every 2 hours through the night and it slowly comes down. Jennifer stays at our apartment with the baby and texts Ryan updates about feedings. In the morning, the doctor says I can go home, but I need to rest and avoid stress as much as possible. She says postpartum preeclampsia can be serious and I need to take it seriously. Ryan drives me home and Jennifer has cleaned our apartment and made food. She hugs me carefully and says she's so sorry this is happening. I sleep most of the day while Jennifer watches the baby. When I wake up, Ryan is sitting next to the bed looking scared. He says maybe we should accept Kevin's settlement offer because my health is more important than the house. I tell him I'm not letting them win after everything they've done. He says he's worried about losing me, and I say, I'll be more careful, but we're not giving up. Word spreads through my nursing network about what happened to me and the house situation. My coworkers from the hospital start asking questions, and I end up telling several of them the whole story. Within days, someone sets up a fundraiser online to help with our legal fees and living expenses. I don't even know who started it at first. My supervisor calls me and says the entire nursing staff wants to help, and they're spreading the fundraiser link to other departments. I'm embarrassed at first because I don't like asking for help, but Ryan says we need it. The fundraiser page explains what Diane and Kevin did, and how we're fighting to get our house back. Donations start coming in from nurses I work with, doctors I've assisted in surgeries, even patients' families who remember me. Within 3 days, there's over $3,000 raised. By the end of the week, it's past $8,000. I'm crying reading the comments from people saying they want to help, and that what happened to us is wrong. Some nurses I barely know donate $100 or more. My supervisor donates $500. The fundraiser gives us enough money to keep paying Maddie and cover our rent for several more months. I call Maddie and tell her we're definitely not accepting Kevin's settlement offer because we can afford to keep fighting now. She sounds relieved and says she was hoping we'd say that because she thinks we can win. The support from my coworkers makes me feel less alone and helpless. Ryan and I sit down and look at the fundraiser page together and read all the kind comments from people. He says we're going to get through this and get our house back. Detective Freeman contacts Maddie and says he needs to interview the title company representative who processed the sale. Her name is Tamara Landry, and at first she doesn't want to talk to him. Maddie tells us Tamara is worried about legal liability for her company. Freeman gets a court order requiring her to be interviewed, and she finally agrees. Maddie isn't there for the interview, but Freeman shares the details with her afterward. Tamara admitted she had concerns about the paperwork timeline because everything happened so fast. Kevin rushed her through the process, and she didn't push back as hard as she should have. She told Freeman she noted irregularities in her internal company files about how quickly the documents were signed and processed. Normally a house sale takes weeks, but this one happened in days. Tamara said Kevin pressured her to close everything immediately, and she went along with it because he was a repeat client. Freeman asked if she noticed anything suspicious about my signature, and Tamara said the documents looked legitimate at the time, but in hindsight the timing was very unusual. Maddie explains that Tamara's testimony is important because it documents that even the title company thought something was off about the sale. Her internal notes about irregularities will help prove Kevin knew he was doing something wrong. Freeman tells Maddie that Tamara's cooperation significantly strengthens the criminal case. The DA's office is now seriously considering fraud charges against both Kevin and Diane. Maddie calls us 2 weeks later with major news. She says the criminal investigation has gotten solid enough that Kevin's attorney is now worried about jail time. Freeman has built a case showing Kevin's pattern of fraud across multiple victims, including Dominic Palmer. The emails between Kevin and Diane prove they planned the whole thing together. Tamara's testimony shows Kevin rushed the sale through knowing it was suspicious. All the evidence about my medical state and the forged documents makes it clear this was deliberate fraud targeting a vulnerable person. Maddie says Kevin's attorney reached out asking to discuss a new settlement on our terms instead of their previous lowball offer. The leverage has completely shifted because Kevin is facing criminal fraud charges that could mean actual prison time. Diane is being investigated as an accomplice since the emails prove she was involved in planning everything. Maddie says this is the first time she really believes we might get our house back. Kevin's attorney wants to meet to discuss terms, and Maddie thinks they'll agree to almost anything to avoid Kevin going to trial on criminal charges. I ask what Diane is facing, and Maddie says if the DA prosecutes her as an accomplice, She could get probation, community service, and have to pay restitution. Ryan looks relieved for the first time in months. We schedule a meeting with Kevin's attorney for the following week to discuss settlement terms. The settlement negotiations take 3 weeks of back and forth through our attorneys, but we finally reach an agreement. Kevin will return the house to us with the deed transferred back into my name. He'll pay all our legal fees, including Maddie's costs and the investigator's fees. He'll pay our moving costs to get back into the house, and he'll compensate us $15,000 for damages and lost equity. The total comes to about $35,000 Kevin has to pay us on top of returning the house. It's not perfect because we'll never get back the 3 months of rent we paid on this apartment or the emotional trauma of everything we went through. But we're getting our home back, and that's what matters most. Kevin is pleading guilty to fraud charges that mean 2 years probation and restitution to his other victims, including Dominic Palmer. He won't do jail time, but he'll have a criminal record and has to pay back everyone he defrauded. Maddie says the DA agreed to probation instead of prison time because Kevin is cooperating and returning our house. We sign the settlement papers at Maddie's office, and I'm shaking the whole time. Ryan squeezes my hand and says we did it. The house will be back in my name within 2 weeks once all the paperwork processes through the court system. Diane's criminal case moves forward separately from Kevin's settlement with us. The DA charges her as an accomplice to fraud based on the emails showing she planned everything with Kevin. She's facing probation, 200 hours of community service, and has to pay restitution of $10,000 to us for her role in the scheme. Maddie explains that Diane's punishment is less severe than Kevin's because she didn't directly benefit from the sale since Kevin never paid her the $20,000 he promised. The DA is treating her more as someone who helped facilitate the fraud rather than the main perpetrator. But she's still getting a criminal record and has to pay us back. The $10,000 restitution is on top of Kevin's settlement, so we'll get $25,000 total in compensation. Diane loses the $20,000 Kevin had promised her, and her financial situation gets even worse instead of better. Jennifer tells us Diane had to sell her condo to avoid foreclosure, and she's moving into a small apartment. Her credit card debt is still there, and now she has legal fees on top of everything. I don't take pleasure in watching her suffer, but there's justice in how her greed and cruelty backfired completely. She tried to steal my inheritance and ended up losing everything herself. The moving truck arrives on a Saturday morning 4 months after we signed those settlement papers, and I stand in the driveway of our house holding my daughter who's gotten so much bigger since that terrible day when we came home to find everything changed. Ryan carries boxes through the front door that Kevin never got a chance to change, and I follow him inside to see the living room where Kevin started tearing out the carpet but never finished. We spend the first day just walking through every room and deciding what needs to be fixed or cleaned or thrown away from Kevin's half-done renovations. The nursery still has the paint I chose before everything fell apart, and I sit in there with my daughter and cry a little because we're finally home. Ryan finds me there and sits down next to us on the floor, and he puts his arm around my shoulders without saying anything for a few minutes. Then he starts talking about his mother and how he should have seen what she was capable of doing, how he let his loyalty to her blind him to all the warning signs that were right in front of him. He apologizes for doubting me when I first told him something was wrong with the paperwork, for taking 3 days to fully believe that his mother had actually stolen our house. We talk for over an hour about what our family is going to look like going forward, about boundaries and trust, and how we protect our daughter from people who claim to love her but act with cruelty. It hurts to have this conversation because Ryan is grieving the mother he thought he had, realizing she was never that person, and I'm watching my husband's heart break, even though I'm also relieved he finally sees the truth. The next week, Ryan calls his mother from our bedroom while I'm in the hallway where I can hear everything. He tells Diane that she can see her granddaughter, but only under supervision, and only after she completes a family therapy program that focuses on boundaries and repairing broken trust. Diane immediately starts arguing that she doesn't need therapy, that she was only trying to help us, that we're being cruel and ungrateful. Ryan stays calm and repeats the conditions without backing down or letting her guilt trip work on him. She threatens to sue for grandparents' rights, and Ryan tells her that would be a terrible idea given her recent criminal conviction for fraud. I hear Diane start crying and saying Ryan is choosing me over his own mother, and he responds that he's choosing his wife and daughter because that's what a husband and father does. The call ends with Diane hanging up on him, and Ryan comes out of the bedroom looking exhausted, but also somehow lighter. I tell him I'm proud of him for putting our nuclear family first, and he hugs me tight and says he should have done it years ago. 6 months after Kevin first changed our locks and Diane destroyed our lives, we're settling into something that feels almost normal. Our daughter is crawling now and getting into everything, and the house feels like ours again after we finished fixing all the damage from Kevin's renovations. Ryan's relationship with his mother exists only through occasional supervised video calls, where Diane refuses to admit she did anything wrong, and I know their relationship will probably never recover. But his sister comes over twice a week to help with the baby, and his brother, who supported us through everything, has become one of our closest friends. We're building the family support system we actually need instead of pretending Diane's toxic control was normal or acceptable. My coworkers still check in regularly to see how we're doing, and the nursing supervisor approved my request to come back part-time so I can spend more time with my daughter. I'm working 3 days a week now, and we're slowly paying down the credit card debt we built up during the legal fight. We're not where we were financially before Diane sold our house, and it'll take another year to get back to that stability. But we're moving forward, and our daughter is thriving in the home my grandfather's inheritance bought, which was always the whole point of fighting so hard to get it back. I've learned that protecting your family sometimes means fighting battles you never imagined you'd face, standing up to people who should love you but choose cruelty instead. I'm stronger for surviving this nightmare, even though I wish none of it had ever happened, and I know now that I can handle whatever comes next because I already survived the worst thing I could imagine.